Okay, so we're diving into something pretty big today, right? Understanding and responding to trauma, especially, how it plays out in our schools and learning environments. And you guys have sent in some really insightful stuff. So our goal here is to kind of pull out those nuggets of wisdom about how we can help students be more resilient and really create spaces where trauma is understood. So think of this as like a crash course, right, on the key concepts and strategies that we can actually put into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're zeroing in on, for this deep dive, we've got excerpts from Fostering Resilient Learners, Strategies for Creating a Trauma-Sensitive Classroom by Kristen Sowers and Pete Hall. This book, it really sheds light on how deeply trauma affects everybody in education, students, obviously. But think about it, their ability to learn, even showing up, attendance, and all those behaviors that we see that can be so challenging.
Right. And it's not just the kids. It's clear from these resources that educators feel it too. The frustration, the burnout, like it impacts job satisfaction across the board. But here's the hopeful part. Recovery is possible, especially for kids. And the biggest factor, you know what it is, relationships, having those strong, supportive connections.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so before we go any further, let's define what we're talking about when we say trauma, right? The book points out that research in this area has just exploded over the last decade. We know so much more now about how significant it is, how it shapes how we grow and learn.
And a big part of that is understanding adverse childhood experiences. We call them ACEs. This comes from the work of these two doctors, Dr. Robert Ansanda and Dr. Vincent Felitti. They did this huge study, the ACE study, with Kaiser Permanente over 17,000 adults. And they found this really strong connection. The more adverse experiences someone had during childhood, things like abuse, neglect, all sorts of issues at home, the greater their risk of having health problems as adults.
Yeah, and what really stood out to me was how common these experiences were. It wasn't just one group or another. It was across all demographics. We really busted that myth that trauma only happens in certain, socioeconomic situations. And this is where they came up with ACE score, right? 0 to 8, based on how many adverse experiences you report.
Right, and they discovered this thing called the dose effect, meaning the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to have negative health outcomes later in life. Like we're talking respiratory problems, STDs, depression, even suicide, early death. It really drives home how these experiences can have a lasting damaging effect on your physical health.
No question.
Hmm.
And while that original study looked at adults, the book digs into more recent research, some by Chris Blodgett's team, specifically about how ACEs affect students in school.
And it turns out there's this triple whammy, right? They call it the ABCs: attendance problems, behavior issues, and trouble with coursework. And again, we see that dose effect. The higher the ACE score, the more likely a student is to struggle in these areas. Like if you have 3 or more ACEs, you're significantly more likely to have attendance issues than someone with none.
Those numbers really make you think. 45% of students had at least one ACE, and 22% had multiple. And then 1 in 16 students, that's a lot, had an ACE score of 4 or higher. It's a pretty stark reality check.
It is. And it wasn't just their academics either. The research showed that kids with higher ACE scores also had more physical health problems, getting sick more often, obesity, asthma, even speech problems. It really reinforces that idea from the original ACE study that these experiences have this ripple effect on your overall health, not just mental health.
Right, exactly. And all of this has really changed how we think about brain development, hasn't it? Like, the book emphasizes how powerful nurture is and how experiencing trauma actually shapes the brain, especially in those early years.
So, knowing that trauma impacts brain development, it makes sense to think about how it shows up in a student's behavior, right? And the book uses this quote from Ross Greene. It's a good one. Kids do well if they can. That really changes our perspective, right? It's not always a choice to misbehave. It's often a response to stress, that fight, flight, or freeze, that survival instinct.
Yeah, and to illustrate this, they use this Julie scenario. It's about a sixth grader in math class who's shut down, refusing to work, just being difficult. And I'm sure a lot of teachers have been
Oh,
there.
yeah, definitely. So the book asks, how do we typically react to a student like Julie? It gives a few options, like disciplinary stuff, removing her from class, or maybe a more connection-based approach, like a one-on-one chat at lunch.
And it points out, how often we jump to that punishment, that disciplinary action, but it makes us ask, is it really defiance? Or is it something deeper, maybe some trauma that we don't even see that's driving that behavior?
Which brings us to the biology of trauma, right? Understanding how it works. So when students are stressed, they're operating from the limbic system, which is all about survival and strong emotions. The book talks about Dr. Dan Siegel's idea of the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. The upstairs is for thinking, problem solving. Downstairs is more about survival and emotions.
And then there's this concept of lid flipping, which is basically a meltdown, right? When the downstairs brain takes over.
Yeah.
And I thought it was so interesting, the idea that we can actually help kids understand this about themselves, to recognize when they're about to flip their lid and learn how to manage those intense feelings.
Oh, yeah. That example with the first grade teacher, it was amazing. The kids using hand signals to show how their brains were feeling, and then using those self-regulation techniques they'd learned. It proves that even little kids can get it. They can learn to manage their emotions.
Absolutely. And then the book, it reveals what's going on with Julie at home, right? Her mom comes home drunk, yelling out of control. Julie's up all night worrying. It really shows how trauma outside of school can show up as these behaviors in the classroom.
And that's such a key takeaway. We, as educators, often don't know the whole story. So creating that safe, predictable environment, giving kids different ways to regulate their emotions, it's so important. Even if we don't know exactly what's going on, it's about being proactive, teaching those skills.
For sure. Okay, so we're getting a clearer picture of how trauma affects students. But the book really stresses the importance of the adult. It says it starts with us. It starts with you. What does that mean?
It means that the biggest thing we can control in creating a trauma-sensitive environment is ourselves. The book talks about cement shoes, the idea of staying grounded in your values, your mission. It uses this example of Mrs. London and how she reacted to a student, Kelly, in a way that went against everything she believed in as a teacher.
Yeah, that really resonated with me. How stress and our own triggers can make us act in ways that we don't really mean. And it highlights how important self-awareness is. Taking time to reflect. We give so much to our students that we sometimes forget to take care of ourselves.
Totally. And it talks about the need to attend to our own well-being, physically, mentally, emotionally, even spiritually. If we're running on empty, we can't possibly show up for our students in the way they need, especially if they're dealing with trauma. It's just not sustainable.
Right. And Pete Hall, he uses this analogy of a tornado. That's a student who's dysregulated, having a meltdown. And he says the key is for the adult to stay in their upstairs brain, to be the calm in the storm, the good witch. That example of Mrs. O'Connor and Channing using the sea of forgetfulness, that really showed that patient, consistent approach.
It did. And then there's Michael in math class, another tornado situation. Mrs. Jones, she reacts from her downstairs brain at first. The book really stresses the need for those proactive strategies to prevent these meltdowns from happening. And for us as educators to be really aware of our own emotional state, our own triggers.
So what are some of those practical strategies the book gives for creating a trauma-sensitive environment? I mean, there's a lot to digest here, so what are the essentials?
Well, they have this 6-step communication process. Listen, reassure, validate, respond, repair, and resolve. And what's interesting, we often focus on listening, responding, resolving. But the book says those middle steps, reassure, validate, and repair, those are crucial and often skipped over when things get heated.
Right, like that example with the parent who's upset, confronting the teacher about something said to their child. It showed how using all 6 steps, especially taking the time to validate the parent's feelings, acknowledging the teacher's part in it, that can make such a difference in how it plays out.
Absolutely. And then there's the power of relationships. The book acknowledges that we're not going to have these deep, lifelong connections with every student, but building relationships that are safe enough, healthy enough, that's essential. Like Sanja's story about her neighbor, just being a consistent, supportive presence, even without a ton of emotional intimacy, that can make a huge impact.
Yeah, and that thing Betsy does, greeting every student at the door, the power of 7 seconds, it seems so small, but it's such a powerful way to connect, to let those kids know they matter.
It is. And the book also talks about this balance, right, between support and accountability. Trauma doesn't give a free pass for bad behavior, but just forcing obedience doesn't teach real accountability either. It's about validating their emotions and then helping them take responsibility, learn better ways to cope.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not about ignoring the behavior, but understanding where it's coming from and giving them tools to do things differently. And I like what the book said about labeling kids. That quote from Socrates shows how this has been going on forever, right? Judging young people.
Oh, yeah. And the book stresses how important it is to keep those challenging kids in the classroom community and to focus on what we can control, like creating that safe and predictable environment, nurturing those relationships, and keeping learning at the forefront, like Miss Jackson and Amber. Shifting her perspective, being a little flexible, it made a huge difference.
So it sounds like changing how we think as educators is crucial. The book uses this doors and windows analogy. What's that about?
It's a way to think about problem solving. When you're stuck with a student, if you're stuck on one approach that's not working, that's the locked door. So look for other options, the windows, the solutions you haven't thought of yet, like with Mr. Fitzgerald and Jamie. He figured out that Jamie had test anxiety, and that led him to a totally different, more supportive strategy.
Right, and maybe one of the most powerful messages in the book is forever changed, not forever damaged. It reminds us not to define students, or even ourselves, by the trauma we've been through, to focus on the strengths, the potential.
I agree. And we need to look for those home runs, those things each student is good at. Shift away from what they lack and see what they excel at. The book even has these questions to help us understand a struggling student's talents, their interest, what motivates them, who they connect with.
And it talks about accepting those difficult emotions.
Yeah.
It's okay to be not okay. Letting ourselves and our students feel those things, process them, grieve. That idea of making meaning, like Viktor Frankl talked about, that need to find purpose even when things are hard. And the importance of secure attachments, having those safe people.
Absolutely. And it warns us about letting fear control our decisions. Don't let fear drive the bus. It challenges those ideas we have about kids today being worse than before. It tells us to separate facts from fear, like that example about kids eating crayons. Sometimes our fear gets in the way of seeing what the real issue is.
It all points to a more compassionate, understanding way of being with our students.
Yeah.
And the book talks about grace and praise. That really struck me, especially that story you told about that moment of grace you got in Fresno. How such a small thing can make such a big difference.
It really can. And it encourages us to look for those opportunities to show grace to our students and to each other. And then there's the power of praise. Dr. Prone, Carol Dweck, they've done research on the impact of positive feedback, especially when you praise effort and resilience, not just ability. It's about building that growth mindset.
Yeah, and that idea of cookies, those genuine compliments we give and receive. And Pete's story about Priscilla experiencing real pride for the first time, so powerful. It shows how important it is to help students see their own accomplishments.
And it even talks about giving ourselves a cookie, acknowledging our own strengths. Our culture doesn't really encourage that, but it's so important for our well-being, our confidence.
Which brings us back to self-care. The book really emphasizes that. It's essential for being effective and, honestly, for surviving as an educator. It talks about 4 things: physical health, connections, competence, and gratitude. We have to take care of ourselves in all those areas if we want to be there for our students.
Absolutely. It's about building a strong foundation so we can be present, supportive, consistently.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot, haven't we? The impact of trauma on students, educators, how important it is to understand the brain, how behavior is communication. We talked about relationships, self-care, and a whole bunch of practical strategies based on empathy and understanding.
And hopefully you, listening, you've got a better grasp on these concepts now, and maybe some ideas you can use in your own life.
Yeah, to leave you with something to think about. We challenge you to consider one small step you can take to create a more trauma-sensitive environment in your world. Maybe it's figuring out your own cement shoes or making a conscious effort to show more grace to someone. What would it look like to consistently offer those moments of connection, that support, in your interactions? Thanks for joining us for this important conversation.
Thanks for listening, everybody.